Any serious initiative hoping to bring the African community together must first conduct an honest assessment of how we have lived in the UK since 1948. If I have time later on in the video, I'll explain why I use the term African or African Caribbean instead of the term black or black community or Caribbean community. So if I have time, I'll explain it later in this short video. From the get-go, we as African people have been exploited for our labor ever since we had the misfortune of coming into contact with the white man. First under slavery, then under colonialism, and now under a new form of colonialism in the UK, neo-colonialism. And until and unless we remove ourselves from the model of domination and exploitation, then the only future we will have in this country is a cold future. Oh, hi, I'm Sunjata. I am the founder and the leader of a brand new organization called Warrior for Power. Our sole aim is to bring about the total, radical transformation of the lives of African people on planet Earth by 2030. Now, if you are a brother, if you are a conscious brother, and if you are fed up of living under white domination, then join Warrior for Power. Go to patreon.com/Warrior for Power. Join today. Our grandparents and parents who came from the Caribbean and Africa hoped for a better life living under white power. They hoped for a better life, but all they got was pain. They wanted joy, but they got pain. Off the bat, the new arrivals from the British colonies were treated like scum. How naive were we back then? We were led to believe that the UK was paved with milk and honey. People came. Lots of them had no skills, but had great hopes and dreams of a better life in the motherland. Others came with determination to obtain work that reflected their experience, their work experience and their qualifications. But they were blocked at every turn. The best jobs were reserved for white workers. The best jobs were unionized. They had good terms and conditions. They had high levels of pay. They came with a lot of respect and status. We were prevented from those jobs in engineering, in medicine, in civil engineering, in high-tech manufacturing, even on the buses, and becoming train drivers where there was a lot of money to be made. We were blocked. We were facing racism in the jobs market. So the Windrush generation had to fight racism if they were going to make Britain their new home. So many fought cases in employment, like the case in Bristol, where the Bristol Bus Company refused to hire West Indian workers. It was a whites-only policy in Bristol. So they launched a bus boycott in Bristol to get the management to hire West Indian workers. Local councils were prevented from providing housing to the Windrush generation and their children in the 1960s and the early part of the 1970s. So you had families living in one house, two families, three families living in one house, all trying to save money through the partner or susu so they could save up enough money to get a deposit on a house so they could move out and eventually buy their own home. Early days of the 1960s, things were going okay for the recent immigrants. Apart from obviously the racist attacks, the police violence, general racism in the society. Apart from that, things were going relatively okay. You could leave a job on the Friday and start with a new employer on the Monday. So people could find work. That was how Britain was for the first half of the 1960s. The public sector soaked up most of our parents' and grandparents' labour. And for the Asians came largely to work in the textile industries in the north. And those who weren't in textiles ended up in corner shops. The corner shops that the British no longer wanted to. Now, there's been some criticism of the Windrush generation. People said, why didn't they go into businesses? Why didn't they become landlords and buy and sell houses? Well, you have to remember where we as a people come from, and we have to be clear about this. And I'm talking particularly about the Africans from the Caribbean. We were enslaved for a long time, and out of slavery, the only thing we had to sell was our labour. And under colonialism, which went on right up into the 60s and early 70s, the only thing we were selling was our labour. So when we came to the UK, we had nothing else. We only had our labour to sell. We did not have a track record of starting and running successful businesses. We didn't do that in the Caribbean, so we certainly weren't going to do it in the UK. And there were many more obstacles to us establishing a business in the UK and making it successful. So the criticism of the Windrush generation is unfair because they never had that experience. They were not petty bourgeois business owners or petty bourgeois landlords or landladies. That was not typical of the population that left the Caribbean in the 1950s, the 1960s and the early 1970s. Do you see? The 1970s came around, and the 1970s were a terrible decade in terms of economic history for the UK. It kicked off with an oil shock due to trouble in the Middle East. Oil prices went up, and if you didn't know, pretty much everything is driven by oil. our food, medicines, everything has an oil component to it. So when the price went up, the cost of living went up. Then you had the miners go on strike for better pay and conditions. There was then, what was it? There was electricity shortages because you needed the coal to burn to create the electricity. So there were electrical outages. So you had what they call the 4-day week and electricity cutouts. People had to have candles. So inflation was going high. The private sector was laying off staff. The public sector was facing strike after strike after strike. And between 1971 and 1981, there was a massive drop of West Indians or Africans or Caribbean people living in the UK. People had had enough and they decided to go back home to the Caribbean and back to Africa. The place was in a mess. And the people of Britain elected the wicked witch from the east. So the early part of the 1980s, there was huge amounts of unemployment. Mrs. Thatcher had this bright idea that if you cut the money supply, you will reduce the rate of inflation. All that did was it forced the private sector to reduce investment and make people unemployed. The car industry was being hit hard. The public sector was reining in its spending. So you had the public sector reining in its spending. You had the private sector reining in its spending, leaving 3 million plus unemployed. Well, those who were leaving those who were leaving school in the late 1970s, early 80s, were leaving school and going straight on to the dole queue. And if you were a West Indian youth at the time, you were then being picked on, bullied, harassed by the police under their stop and search laws, SUS. Well, the young people weren't having it anymore. And by 1981, April of 1981, we just marked 40 years back in April. By 1981, riots had kicked off across the country and kicked off in Brixton, London. This shook white society that they realised that these West Indians born in the UK subjects were here to stay. They weren't going anywhere, and a solution needed to be found. So, those who were educated, those who were prepared to play the game, and those who were agreeable to white power got jobs in the civil service, in the local authorities, in some of the high street banks and institutions. And those who were unagreeable were left to the street, were left to the police, were left to the courts, were left to mental institutions, were left to become entrepreneurs or self-employed. That's really what happened in that period. Now we come to the end of the 80s. You have the Big Bang in the City of London. All old, archaic trading practices were blown away. They went for computerization. A lot of money started to flow around London. We had the rise of the yuppies, and we had the rise of the buppies. That's black yuppies to you and me. But the majority of us were still catching hell. Stroll on to 1997. Tony Blair comes into power, offering not to change a thing, to keep the status quo. And the status quo at that time was property prices were going up after a decade of negative equity in the housing market. Property prices were going up. Tony Blair called on 50% of all young people to go to university. Many in our community did, and we still faced high levels of unemployment, greater than for white people and for Asian people. Many of us got degrees and then got jobs that did not match, so we couldn't put our degrees to work, and therefore we couldn't get higher pay. So overall, our incomes were low. This was the condition of the late 1990s, early 2000s. We now hit 2020s. We are struggling. We have high, persistent unemployment within our community. And if you look at the data closely, it has never been resolved since the mid-1970s. We have a high number of children being excluded from school. We are the largest group of children as a proportion of the population in local authority care. We have a high number of our community in prison, something like 4 times our rate within the general population, much higher than in the US. We have a significant percentage of our people involved in mental health institutions or are being given highly toxic psychotic drugs on a weekly, monthly, or quarterly basis. The level of employment is still very low in our community. The level of entrepreneurship is still very low in our community. All this is what we've faced. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, it's better than being in the Caribbean, better than being in Africa, which is true, but not much better. As I've stated, we as an African people in the UK are suffering. I've gone through the list. So the only solution is to close the doors to our community. We should then control the assets in our community. And one of our biggest assets is the term African and African Caribbean. We need to establish large institutions and organizations that can control our assets, which will create employment, gainful employment, good employment for our community, and deliver the profits and the income and the dividends required to lift our community up. That is the only solution. Okay, I'm Sunjata. You've been watching Warrior for Power. Power be. The only thing that is pushed in our community is direct sales, pyramid marketing, property investments. There is no country that has built itself into a powerhouse based on speculating on the property market. And in the Caribbean, we have been forced to go into the tourism sector, and there's no country on earth that has developed itself into a high-income country on the basis of tourism. So you see, in the UK, we're forced into property, investing, and in the Caribbean, into tourism. They're not delivering the jobs or the quality of life that our people need. Now, you might say, well, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So if the British are spending their money on housing, then we should do the same. But I believe we should think a little bit harder and go against the grain. Now, I was going to promise you, or I did promise you, why to give you a reason why I use the term African instead of black. Well, to sum it up simply, African is a brand. African Caribbean is a brand. If we are to get out of the position that we're in, we need to close our community. And then we need to use our cultural heritage and experience and history as a way of generating income and profits for our community through large organizations. We cannot do that defining ourselves as black. That's not possible. Secondly, we live here under a model of domination and exploitation based on the binary relationship between black and white. You see, we have to break the black and white binary relationship so we can move away or move out from under domination and exploitation within the UK. And the only way you can do that is to refer to yourself outside of the system that they've set up for us. And we can develop our own systems. So you're saying to yourself now, well, what does that mean? Well, the Chinese control Chinese medicine. They don't call it yellow medicine. The Indians control the Indian restaurant trade. They do not call it the brown restaurant trade. Do you see? Controlling your brand allows you to control an asset. It's an invisible asset, but it's an asset nevertheless, like a patent or a copyright or royalty. We own the identity of being African or African Caribbean. We should use that as an asset that we can use to create incomes that can lift our community. So, if any of this makes sense to you, then get involved, not just with my organization, but with any organization that is seeking to find a solution collectively. If it's for individuals or a group of you want to exploit the property market, fair enough, that's down to you. But if you want to do something bigger or greater than yourself, then this is the area that you need to look into. Because we have real economic history in the UK, and it's not a good one. So we have to change our economic history or future in the UK. Okay, I'm Sanjata. Thanks for listening. Power be.